No matter how effective the assessment tool you're using, whether it's the secondary survey that I showed you of sampler and promiser, or whether it's something like the multi-axis classification system or the GAF scale, it's not going to work very effectively if you aren't mindful about the way you're communicating. Nothing will get past poor communication skills. Probably many of you have heard over the years of something called the communication triangle or pyramid, and it's often misinterpreted even though the underlying message has been validated over the years. Albert Mehrabian was a UCLA researcher who did two studies in which he asked people to describe what form of communication they most liked when people were talking about their feelings. 7% of the people said they preferred a purely verbal approach. 38% said they preferred a paraverbal approach, in other words, one where people use the tone, volume, and cadence or speed of their voice to communicate their feelings. And 55% said they were more interested or more responsive to nonverbal communication. And in Mehrabian's case, that was particularly focused on facial expressions, although subsequent studies have also looked at full body language, like, for example, your posture, your rate of approach, and so forth. Here's the main point. The main point is whether or not it's all about 7%, 38%, or 55%, we are far more likely to be effective communicators if we integrate the verbal, paraverbal, and nonverbal effectively. People will vastly respond to us better if our verbal communication is congruent with the other aspects of our communication. So we need to be mindful, deliberate, and practiced in all of these things, or else no matter what technique we're using, we're not going to get very far. Probably almost all of us have had an unsatisfactory interaction with a medical medical professional, I should say, a police officer, or somebody else in an emergency response capacity. And it's often because those individuals are simply overworked. They're good people and they're professional and they're working hard. But it is difficult when you have the sorts of workloads and stress levels that many of these professionals experience to be mindful about this sort of thing. It's sort of like having to be Bruce Springsteen singing Born to Run every night on stage for 30 years, despite what might be going on elsewhere in your career or in your life. People expect you to sing it with the same passion every single time, and yet the truth of the matter is it gets harder and harder to do. So, like Bruce Springsteen, we need to practice. We need to be adept at this so that on the one hand, it's somewhat second nature to us. On the other hand, we never take it for granted. We're thoughtful about it. So here are some basic tips for communicating, including the first one, which is a repeat of something in Module 2, and that is that we want to approach people using a non-threatening approach and a supportive stance. And if you didn't study Module 2 yet, please do, but I will put the video back up. A supportive stance refers to the idea we want to stand approximately a leg's length away from a person. Our face should be towards them, but our chest should be set at a 90-degree angle so that we are not threatening to that individual, not imposing in their personal space or making them feel as though we disrespect them, and we're providing a safety outlet for them and for us. So please review that video. I'll put the link back up again under Module 3, I'm sorry. We also have to think about something called our presence and our engagement. Now, most of what I'm going to talk to you about today, I can be very concrete about. But when it comes to presence and engagement, there is no substitute for self-analysis. I strongly encourage you to do something like use a video camera, get yourself in front of a mirror, or the best of all, practice with a friend who is a really good critical friend. What I mean by a critical friend is they're going to be really honest and constructive with you about your feedback. We have to practice the skills that help us to present with confidence and openness, and that's what we mean by presence and engagement. Presence is really hard to describe, but it's essentially the feeling of one's aura, the feeling that somebody is genuinely with us and what they're bringing to the equation. Sometimes we talk about charisma, for example, or a way of evoking a sense of calm in other people. And engagement really means how do we make people feel like we're really open to them and welcoming to them? How do we sometimes talk about friendliness, but friendliness and engagement are not exactly the same, because friendliness is something we think of typically in non-professional relationships, and engagement is perhaps a better way of talking about people who are going to be engaged in a professional capacity. So for you, do that practice. And I'll tell you what works for me as some of the things to think about in terms of confidence. For me, I have to think about my head position. It happens that one of my hobbies is to be a photographer, and I often do portraiture. And it's amazing how much confidence is conveyed by a person lifting their chin somewhat. When we're looking down, we literally look as though we are low in confidence. And we all have seen pictures of people who are regal with their heads held high. And there's no accident in that expression. So when I walk towards a person or stand towards a person, I genuinely try to keep my chin up and my eyes as well. I try to make sure that I am not distracted looking elsewhere. My hands and feet are used in purposeful ways, not fidgets. I try not to stand with one hip being emphasized, and I don't shift from one hip to the next. I don't have objects in my hands that aren't for purposeful reasons. I don't want to have a fidget, as I said. And I want to be really attentive to my breathing. For me, it's important to breathe in through my nose and out through my mouth, and practice the rate of my breathing. Even think about your communication. Saying things directly and saying things in a succinct way as much as possible is important. Using feeling words or the same language you're hoping the other person will use towards you. And it might be silly to say this because I'm speaking so much to you throughout this presentation, but one of the things that makes a big difference for me when I'm engaged with individuals in crisis is for me to get it short and sweet. I had to deal just the other day with two individuals who were engaged in a conflict where I work, and I had to go up and tell them, "Stop it now." And that was the entire sentence that I said to them. Once they stopped their physical interaction, I then said, "You go here, you go there." And that's really how I want to keep my communication. Very simple, short, and sweet. When I'm approaching somebody and thinking about how to convey that I'm friendly and engaging, I also have to think about things that work for me. And again, these may not work entirely for you, but I think about where I put my hands. So the hand position video was part of this, making sure that my hands are laid in a way that is not hiding a possible object and are open. I want to make sure that my smile is sincere. So that means I have to do some mental preparation and genuinely want to be interested in helping that individual. Again, I think about eye contact and tone of voice, and there's nothing that will substitute being able to do this. Being able to practice for this. We also have to think about how we attend to individuals. And attending simply means paying attention or demonstrating physically that we are there for that individual. I like to use the mnemonic FELOR. FELOR stands for the following 5 things, and I'll say them slowly so that you can write them down. F is for face the person. E, eye contact. L, lean forward slightly. O, open posture. R, relax. So, F, facing the person. We don't want to make it sound confusing. We're still going to be in that supportive stance where my body is at about 90 degrees to the person, but my face is still looking at that person. Eye contact is really important, but we also can't be too overly concerned about it. For example, we need to be concerned or thinking about people's ethnicity or their diagnosis. People, for example, of Korean descent or First Nation descent may have been culturally raised to use deferential eye contact. In other words, to look away from a person's eyes as a way of showing respect. Forcing them to look you in the eyes might make them feel uncomfortable. And the same is true for people, for example, on the autistic spectrum disorder, or people who are in a paranoid state that may be challenging for them. And somebody who's psychotic may have simple difficulty, or delirious, simple difficulty maintaining eye contact. Anyways. And remember, it's eye contact, not a staring contest. Very much like touch, it should be done contextually, should be done briefly, and should be done repeatedly. When we lean forward, we want to make sure we don't look like we're hawking over somebody. And a real simple way to practice this is to take a fist and put it behind your back. And you'll see if you have your fist approximately at the middle of your back, touching both your back and the chair, and then remove it, that little bit of a lean shows that you're interested. Leaning further forward than that, for example, if you're leaning on your knees, shows people that you're kind of hawking over them, or you're imposing in their personal space. Open posture refers to the idea that we don't want to create barriers with our body. So some of the things that people need to think about are crossing their arms, crossing their legs, and of course if people are wearing skirts, then we cross our legs as a social convention, but other than that we shouldn't be doing it. Or even having major barriers such as desks in between us. Something like a coffee table that is lower is generally considered not to be an impediment because it's down below our knees. But other objects in between us can be a hassle or can be a barrier. And there are even some things that people do that are more subtle, like wearing hats or letting their hair fall over their face. And those are tricks that sometimes I've seen youth do as a way of creating a barrier, and they're very aware of it if we do that to them. Sunglasses would be another classic example. And R is for relax. This is something we need to mentally and physically prepare to do. Let our body muscle tension be let go, take a deep breath, and mentally prepare to be focused on understanding that person, genuinely trying to figure out what they're communicating to you. Don't worry about what you're going to say next, or advising, correcting, or interpreting what that person has to say. Just keep it simple at this point with trying to receive what they're saying, and particularly capturing the greater meaning of their conversation with you and the feeling behind it. We also want to do what we can to reduce interruptions, turning off social media or cell phones, asking others who work with us to perhaps keep the interruptions to a minimum or completely eliminate them by dealing with other people, going off to a private space. Any of these kinds of things can help. Now, there will be times when an individual will need to speak to you for longer than you can give sustained attention. And this is when I like to use meta communication or concrete communication to tell a person what I can do for them and how we'll adjust. So I might, for example, say to somebody, I can give you 5 minutes before I know somebody may come and interrupt me. But if that happens, I promise you that we will set a time to continue this conversation, or I will step out for 1 minute and be back. So that helps a person to really understand some of the abstract or unclear things that are going to be happening in your communication, and that will in turn often reduce anxiety and make a person feel that you're really there for them. Whenever we're listening to a person, we need to acknowledge and paraphrase. And I want you to think about communication very much like you would think about an automobile rally race. Now, if you're not familiar with rally races, these are races where the cars travel through dirt roads, up through the mountains and so forth, often in places in Europe. They travel for hundreds of miles, but they don't travel those hundreds of miles in one journey. Instead, they do a number of smaller journeys and then they stop at checkpoints. If they have correctly gone the route and the checkpoint person acknowledges that, then they continue on to the next area. But if they haven't, they have to go backtracking and do it correctly. Now, this is a great metaphor, in my opinion, for how people communicate. Have you ever noticed when you're speaking to somebody that at a period they will sort of pause? Sometimes people pause rarely and other people pause frequently. It's really just a personal preference in terms of finding out how connected you are what they're saying. And what they're doing at that pausing is actually very similar to that rally racer checking in and making sure that they're on track and that you're with them. If you identify for them that you captured what they meant in that last bit of communication and that you both got the summary of their facts and the emotional content, they're far more likely to continue on. If they can tell by your reflection back to them that you missed some of what they said, they're very likely to backtrack and try again. They may try that 1 or 2 times, but if they have to keep going back and backtracking, they're probably going to give up on the communication or get frustrated. Paraphrasing means that we summarize and reflect back in our own words what the person has just said to us. It's okay to use some of the words that the person has used, especially ones that seem to be particularly key or important to that individual. But generally speaking, we're trying to summarize the theme of what they said. Sometimes people will go on for great lengths, detailing an entire chronology of events. It is not an expectation of people in most cases that you will be able to repeat back all these times and dates and names. Instead, it's much more important for you to capture the main idea and then to tell the person in your own words what emotion you think is part of that. For example, you might have worked with people who were decompensating and were rambling on about an interaction with staff in a facility where they were being housed. And at the end of that, it would be appropriate for you to say something like this. It sounds like this has been a long-standing issue, or it sounds like there have been a lot of problems between you and the people at work, or it sounds like this has been going on for quite a long time. That is enough of a summary of the facts that you can move on to the second part of your statement, which is the emotional part of it, and it might sound like something like this. And it sounds like you're really frustrated, or it sounds like you've really had some emotional challenges with that, or it sounds like you're really disappointed in the people there. You really don't need to say a lot more than that, and just finish up with some silence. And the person will then treat that essentially as a question and an invitation to continue to communicate. We want to avoid flag words. Did you hear the flag word I used in the last one? The word problem for many people is a bit of a flag. And the reason that it's a flag is because it's one of those words that subtly reminds us of things that we might have experienced that could be inflammatory or upsetting. Sometimes these words are jargon. Sometimes they're expressions that imply judgment or condemnation by other people. So I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, the word never and always. You never do what I ask you, or you always are late. When we say that to people, it tends to have a negative response, an inflammatory response, and it's just that one little word. Now, sometimes people, when I think when I say flag words, that I'm speaking about really obvious words like fat or stupid, but those words are already clearly outside the boundaries of what we should be saying. They're not professional. Instead, think about words that are far more subtle. You're going to be asked to do that in a moment in an exercise. Think about, for example, the difference between using words that sentences that start with I versus sentences that start with you. And think about which one of those is easier to receive. You might be surprised by the answer. Whenever we're paraphrasing or just plain listening to people, we want our attention and our reflection back to them to be focused on the feeling and meaning of what they're saying. I won't go on about this much longer because I've already dealt with it 2 bullet points ago. But really, it's all about trying to get at the root of what people are telling you from a feeling and meaning perspective. And it's really important for us to avoid detouring or asking questions that get away from this. I want you to imagine a situation where you've told somebody about a loss or grieving that you're going through. For example, the loss of a loved one. You probably have had conversations with people that talked about how hard it is for you to adjust, or how much you love this person, or how hard it is for you to understand that they're actually gone. And in some cases in their interactions with people, they have responded by saying things like, "I'm sorry to hear that. How old was the person?" or "How did they die?" And what they're really communicating, when you think about it, is that they're having a hard time relating to you in terms of the stuff that you care about. This can often be enough for us to realize that person is having a difficult time relating and for us to move on in the conversation. And if it's somebody we expected to be a good listener, it can build up resentment. So avoid asking questions that are focused entirely on the details. That sort of thing is, generally speaking, not important. We tell the facts of a story generally only as a way of getting to the stuff that really matters to us, our feelings, our thoughts, our motivations. So here's one of 2 exercises we're going to ask you to do before we pause for this video. First, in the journal, take a 90-second quick write to write down as many flag words as you can. And remember, these words are subtle but inflammatory words, often jargon or expressions that sound accusatory that we use with other people. Take a look afterwards at what others have written and see if you have some of the same ones. It's amazing how many of these have snuck into our daily versions of communication with people. Compare with a partner, or as I said, online looking at the journal. The second thing we want you to do is a simple sort of role play type exercise. And again, you can write your answers into the blog. Imagine that a subject said the following, and there's 2 expressions we've got for you. How would you summarize and paraphrase to capture the meaning? Compare your responses and try to not get trapped by some of the things that the person says that might be triggers for you. I'm going to do my best to use the tone I would imagine these things being said in, but you can imagine a tone if you feel it suits you better. My mom keeps hassling me to take my meds, or else she's going to kick me out. She's such a bitch. She has no idea what those effing drugs even do to me. They're poison. The second one is, I don't care if you guys lock me out. I can't leave my dog outside without checking on her. You guys are such hypocrites. You only care about your stupid rules. I want you to imagine in both of those cases that you have to sincerely respond to that individual in a way that demonstrates non-judgment and empathy without sounding programmed and formulaic. It has to sound sincere. So try to do that and then compare your results with that of others. We'll give you some feedback on both parts of these exercises when we come back in the next video.